Well, this is Dan Whitman. We are continuing. This is a an added module. We're going to talk about that in a moment to international crisis management. It is now January 5th. Somehow we made it to 2026. Um, it's been the last few months and years have been just simply crisis, more crisis. I guess crisis management. Maybe that's why we're all working on this. Where do we start? Let me briefly. I may have to do this again on Thursday when more people join. What we're going to do in January and February, you can call it a course if you want to, but with these qualifications, it's really half of a course. It's um, it's 2 months, not four. We'll do this in maybe 8 or 10 sessions, and that's one distinction. Uh, Also. You can call it a course. I want to think of this as a workshop. Let me try to explain what I mean by that. We've all been very academic up until now. We've been studying, and some of you have produced amazing, wonderful academic papers. And I encourage you to continue in that way. And I know some of the people in this group are more familiar with academic pursuits than actions in the world. I really want this to become a workshop in that um, let's do something about FEME. Uh, we all know what FEME is. We used to call it disinformatia. Um, it's very obvious what
It's
it
very
is.
obvious.
It's very clear where it comes from and how it comes. We've all listened to lectures. To me, yes, Matthias, that is true. We've all listened to people tell us about FEME and what it is. I become very bored, very uninterested. I'm not interested in hearing about how somebody is very smart and knows what FEME is. So what? So what? So you know what it is. I want this group to do something about it. We'll spend more time on that on Thursday. Um, I see. We all know what Russia is doing with disinformation, foreign information, and malign interference. FEME used to call it disinformatia. I don't know why they decided to change the word. It's disinformatia. I don't care what you call it. It's bad. Let's do something. And in that in that light, two assignments. If you're looking for a certificate for this, I'm going to call it a module. It's not really a course. It's not. It could be academic if you want it to be. That's okay. I would rather think of it as a workshop. Um, we'll see what we can accomplish. Two assignments for those wanting a certificate. February 1st, a strategic communications plan. Um, I want to not get into that too much today. I promise we'll talk more Thursday about what is a strategic communications plan. We can think of that in light of business, large corporations, nation states, embassies. Um, we're going to try to learn and do these plans. Um, there's no absolute right or wrong way to do this. I'm going to show you a matrix or two, and and then ask you to just do a plan. It could be 2 or 3 pages. First assignment. Second assignment. By March 1st, that would be the end of this course. The end of this course, March 1st. Uh, Two options. You can do a study if you want, and I would be very honored to receive it. You can describe any aspect. We can talk individually about the topics that you might want to go into. Frankly, I would rather that the certificate candidates actually become involved, engagé, involved in this sphere. The Western countries, as far as I can see, the government are doing nothing, nothing to counter Russian interference, FIMI, disinformatia. I um, I'm amazed at how skilled the Russian lying machine is and how completely useless are the various government responses. We know that when some false information comes out, and a government, through its spokesman, will say, this is not true, and we have evidence to the contrary. Who listens to that? Nobody, nobody. Um, we need to get into the social media. I'm of an age where I'm disqualified. I'm not qualified to do that. And I would hope that people in this group, maybe working together, maybe working individually, could actually enter the social media space. Um, Perhaps, Ella, I'm going to show you maybe today, maybe Thursday, a list of the various groups that I know of. There must be hundreds. I have maybe a dozen that work out of Europe, North America, and I would ask you to have a look at these websites. The most astonishingly good one that I have found is one called Ukrainer.net. I'll show you that later today or Thursday. It's amazing. How do they do what they do? They have wonderful postings and history and comments on culture. Um, how do they do it? Maybe they would be willing to have volunteers from this group work with them. Um, so again, I'm going to think of this as a workshop more than a course. It's 2 months, not four, so it's really half of a course. I apologize for the certificate delay. That's all I'll say. If you need a letter while waiting for Delphi Global Research Center to, they've been delayed. If as some of you have deadlines for application, just tell me and I'll send you a letter, which will be a placeholder until the certificate comes. Now, um, let's get into what we're doing today. Um, FIMI, let's start by looking at this crap that comes out of the Russian Federation. This is shocking. Um, I is this not shocking? Now, how did I find this? You have a Nazi propaganda poster on the left. You have a current today Russian propaganda on the right. Do the Russians have no ability to invent their own propaganda? Do they have to use the Nazi propaganda? This is shocking. Where did I get these posters? From Ukrainer.net. They are amazing. And today or Thursday, we'll have a closer look at what they do on that website. I think some Ukrainians on this call may be familiar with Ukrainer.net. There's also Adastra. There are a number of groups working separately, independently. I think they would have all to gain by comparing techniques and lessons learned. I don't know if we're capable as a group of facilitating that, but here's the problem. It's right here. Now, I'm going to stop share. I'm going to go back into share. Now, a former Ukrainian foreign minister, here we go, Dmitry Kuleba, um, wrote an astonishing book called The War Against Truth, something like that. Ukrainians are familiar with this book, I think. I read it, actually began to read it in Kyiv when I was there in June. I've never met Dmytro Kuleba. I've heard Ukrainians say, wonderful academic, great researcher, not such a good foreign minister. He was foreign minister. I have no opinion. I can't say. This book is long, it's arduous, but here's what he puts at the very beginning of the book. This is before he begins narrating. A brook is quietly flowing. You know it is it that brainwashes us. Quoting Ihor Husiev, a 21st century Ukrainian painter. Um, this is kind of like um, a haiku, isn't it? In fact, maybe it is a haiku. That brainwashes. I think it is a haiku. Um, and he just, just to introduce the reader to what he's talking about. And then he quotes 17th century English author John Milton, who, if you're, I think you're familiar with Milton. I'm guessing nobody has read all of Milton. Nobody does anymore. But Paradise Lost, his very long, incredible poem. It goes hundreds of pages describing how God and Satan took separate paths. And it's often noted that in this book, the character that gets the most attention is not God, it's not humankind, it's Satan. Um, and Milton, I don't know if he did this on purpose, but he makes Satan the interesting character in his book. And he quotes John Milton, "The mind is its own place, and in itself can make heaven of hell a hell of heaven." So we're talking about perceptions. Perceptions are what we're looking at. Um, Here is, I think this is page one of the Kuleba book, and it's very short. I think we can maybe even read part of it. He's describing a time when he visited the SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. We call it SACEUR, Mark Leahy. And Leahy gave to Kuleba a souvenir. It was a coin, which is the coin of I guess it was NATO or one aspect of NATO. On one side of the coin was a logo of the commander, not much interesting. On the other side was far more interesting, the famous Mouth of Truth from Rome, and the inscription, "Perception becomes reality." Now, isn't that interesting? A military command post perfectly aware of the threat of disinformation. Let's call it disinformation, FEMI, I don't know. Call it what you want. But the U.S. military, which does some good things and some bad things, is very good at what we used to call hearts and minds. The need to um, convey a truth to a foreign country, to the people of a foreign country, and to seek to convince them that we are more good than bad. Now, never mind whether we really are good. That's another question after Venezuela. I don't know how good we are. But the perception, even in military strategy, and this comes from ancient Rome, perception becomes reality. Boca della veritas. The message was obvious. Reality consists of our perceptions, and the task of the department, that would be the Department of Defense, is to shape them based on truth. This is a truly noble goal for peace, and even more so for political, social, and commercial war. I'm not giving you any news that you did not know, but hybrid warfare, we're all familiar with that. We don't need lectures and opinions. We know about hybrid warfare, which consists of dynamic, kinetic, weapons-based strategies, and also the mental framework behind them. Is there anything else I should say before we go into um, my presentation today? I'm going to show you a PowerPoint. I hope two PowerPoints. Let's see. Sorry, why I admit people. There we go. So, is there anything I need to say? Again, Thursday, what we're going to do is, let me just give you a very brief idea. Here, first of all, and all of this is on Google Classroom, by the way. Here are some links to organizations that are doing things about FEMI and disinformation. This one, Ukrainer.net, is, I think, the most amazing. This is amazing. Look what they do. It's incredible. Um, the research, the visual layout of what they do, the history, it's quite amazing. My question is, so what? What does, what does a beautiful layout do in the world Uh, it's a terrific. I absolutely admire what um, what Ukrainer.net is doing. My question is, how does it change anything? That's what I want us to try to do. I cannot do that. I'm too old. I'm not familiar with social media. You, the participants here, can, I hope, find ways of countering it. I'm still in the intro section here. Let us define these terms. Stratcom, strategic communications. Strategic communications imply a plan. This can be a commercial corporation, it can be an embassy, it can be a nation state, a foreign ministry. To be able to construct a Stratcom will be part one of this two-part module. I'm going to call it a module, not a course. What is public diplomacy? How does it differ from public affairs? In the United States, we make this distinction when we have embassies in various countries seeking to communicate, seeking to convey messages. I hope they're always true. Um, uh, the tradition of telling the truth is embedded in American foreign policy. I cannot guarantee that it's always going to be that way. But public diplomacy is what we do in foreign countries. Public affairs is what we do in our own country. So when in previous times, when the State Department clearly made this distinction, you would have the spokesperson of the State Department give a briefing for any journalist in the room. You may have seen videos of these. I can try to find one if you want. We're more familiar with White House briefings, but the State Department, the Defense Department, the CIA, they all give briefings. Any accredited journalist is entitled to be in the room. However, there are two separate offices. One, public diplomacy, which is the office that supplies information and resources to U.S. embassies overseas, and there's public affairs, in which the State Department or Defense or the White House um, is more focused on dealing with domestic local media. So we make that distinction. Disinformation, we all know this comes from the Soviet Union. Disinformatia, it's a Russian word. We all know what that is. And we all know that it goes back hundreds of years in Russia. Um, Russia was not the only country to work very hard on disinformatia. I personally believe that the Soviet Union was more skillful than any other country in supplying crap. We call it disinformatia. FIMI. Um, we're told we're not supposed to use the word disinformation. I don't know why. To me, I use it, but I see FIMI as exactly the same. These are semantic differences. Disinformation. FIMI, we'll refer to FIMI as a contracted form instead of each time saying foreign information and malign interference. We'll just call it FIMI. Soft power. You're familiar with Joseph Nye. If not, I've supplied that to you in your Google Classroom. We'll look at what I've added. We'll do that on Thursday. Soft power is the actions of a government to try to change the opinion of a foreign country without using military force. This can be through rhetoric, through projects being done together. It can be done through alliances. Um, the uh, the question of economic power is not soft, it's not hard, it's smart. We call it smart power. Hard power would be bullets, guns, military, bombs, airplanes. Soft power would be the ability to communicate. And then somewhere in the middle, Joseph Nye made that distinction. I met him once. Soft power is what I'm very comfortable with soft power. I'm not comfortable with hard power, um, which is kinetic. Kinetic meaning killing people. Soft power is communication. And then between these two different notions, there's something in the middle called smart power. Now, an example of that would be economic sanctions, which we're using plenty right now. The European Union, the United States, Japan, others, with the sanctions imposed on Russia. That's not kinetic. It's also not soft. We call it smart. Okay. And then propaganda. How do we distinguish between propaganda and public diplomacy? It may appear simple, but it's not. Let me take one. Okay, let's go straight into a couple of PowerPoints. And this, I think, in realistically, this is probably all I can do today. I want to expand. Oh, shucks. Um, with ah, my screen is not cooperating. I want to expand on the screen. Well, you'll just have to bear with me. I'm unable to see the bottom of my screen because of a toolbar that blocks it. So we'll just do it. Okay, public diplomacy. This is what I used to do when I worked in the State Department and previously in the U.S. Information Agency. Um, and you'll see this is part one. Let's look at what is public diplomacy, because public diplomacy uses strategic communications in fashioning its messages to foreign publics. Oh, here we go. No, can't do it. Sorry, the screen will not be filled with the image. We'll just deal with it. Now, um, diplomacy, uh, diplomacy, when it works, and when it works properly, should be seen as actions in order to persuade. Country X wants to influence country Y for various reasons. They may want to intimidate them. They may want the natural resources. They may want to convince the foreign country that they have more in common, X with Y, than they might perceive. And so this is done through communication, strategic communication. The inventor of the term, I mean, the action goes way back for centuries. Joseph Nye in 2004 in his book Soft Power. I have on your Google Classroom the entire book. It's not long, and he defines it pretty simple. Soft power is the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or bribes, payments. Pretty simple. And this has to do with communicating strategically. Now, in the past 25 century, 2,500 years, we have not yet come up with a better formula for rhetoric and communication and persuasion, let's call it persuasion, than Aristotle. Some of you have read rhetoric or sections of rhetoric, Aristotle's work, in which he talks about the three elements: ethos, logos, pathos. Let me try to define them, and I'm not going to use quotes here. Ethos, the ability to understand where you are. Pretty simple, isn't it? But let's say you are a foreign minister making a speech. Let's say you've traveled abroad and you have 300 world leaders in the room, maybe Munich Security Conference, something like that. Ethos, the awareness, who is your audience? I see many, many strategic communications which fail, completely fail at understanding who is the audience. Who are you talking with? Are they informed? Are they stupid? Are they smart? Do they have their own biases? Who are they? You cannot convince anybody of anything until you understand. Call it strategic empathy. Remember that? Um, a tactical empathy. Understand, where do you fit in a world where different opinions are being aired in public. Who are you talking to? We've all seen speeches, stupid speeches, where the person goes out with talking points, blah, 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 point A, point B, completely useless until they understand this audience has some understanding of this notion, or has no understanding, or has a different understanding. Nobody came up with this any better than Aristotle. Understand the context. We call it ethos. Logos, you see the Greek word for the word, but logos has the greater meaning is logic. Um, the syllogism, the logic that seeks to prove something. The only absolute proof that we have as humans is mathematics, 2 plus 2 and all of that. Um, when we make an argument, let's say in a court of law or in a diplomatic situation, um, we, number one, need to understand who are we talking to, who am I, who are they, and also demonstrate through logic. Logic can be um, inductive or deductive. It can be gathering things that are true. You can show unretouched photos. You can supply data, information, things that have been gathered, statistics. You can also say, well, if this, then that. That's that's a syllogism. If you believe in God, then you should believe that there's such a thing as God-given rights. Now, conservatives tend to use that very syllogism. They will they will imply, they will assume you believe in God because they do. And they say, well, therefore, Declaration of Independence of the United States, 1776, we have God-given rights. The major premise, the assumption is you believe in God. The minor um, assumption is that you believe um, that there's a logical explanation to prove that we have God-given rights. The problem with logos is if you don't agree with the major premise, then you cannot agree with the conclusions that are drawn. Aristotle goes into all of this. Rhetoric is not all that long. It's not all that difficult. It's a very formal text. You might try reading it sometime. Again, 2,500 years, no one has come up with a better formula to show us what are the tools we have in persuading. And finally, and this is the really interesting one, pathos. In English, the word pathos means, sad and dreary and pitiful. That's not what Aristotle meant by pathos. He meant the word emotion. Emotion. Now, you can grab the audience with a dramatic photo. You can make a great noise. You can appeal to people's compassion. Look at this photo of this poor person. We looked at some slides in our last session in December, um, where we saw photographs of Ukrainian citizens standing in line to vote. Okay, that's pathos. That evokes an emotion. Now, Aristotle in rhetoric said all three of these, ethos, logos, pathos, they're all valid. There's nothing invalid about any of these elements. The problem is in disinformation, in FEME, their messages tend to be based purely on pathos. And we know from Dmitry Kuleba, in his book, he makes it very clear case that negative emotions are much more effective than positive emotions. If you can inspire fear, anger, distrust, hatred, your message will work much quicker. That's not to say that legitimate communication should not have pathos. It should. The difference is propaganda relies almost entirely on pathos, meaning emotions, usually negative emotions. Dmitry Kuleba makes a strong case for this. He has data and research that indicate a negative emotion, hatred, fear, distrust, anything negative has much greater effect than compassion or understanding or um, a quest to find common ground. And this is the danger and the power of disinformation. Now, Let's look at propaganda before we get to this. This presentation has to do, what's the difference between propaganda and public diplomacy? This is, it sounds easy. It's not, because there's great overlap in what public diplomacy does and with propaganda. Here's a, is that a funny slide? You like that? Um, okay, propaganda. I actually looked this up, and here's the origin of the word. And we're talking about the Catholic Church responding to the Protestant rebellion against the Church of Rome. When the Catholic Church realized that many citizens in Europe were leaving the Church of Rome and becoming Protestants, this became like a culture war. We saw the slides, the horrible conflict, the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. So many killed, so many tortured, starved, died of disease, and horrible. When I'm not blaming the one side more than the other, the Protestants, the Catholics. As I've said to you, I don't believe this really was a religious conflict. It had more to do with hatred, just pure hatred. Anyway, when the Catholic Church developed a strategic communication to respond to um, the Protestant rebellion in a process called the Reformation. That would be the Catholic Church cleaning up its. The Catholic Church was corrupt. They were taking money. Martin Luther made it very clear. The Catholic Church is has problems. Has problems. I mean, any human endeavor has problems. Um, the Catholic Church, with the College of Cardinals, this was it's still today a group of enormous influence and significance. The word comes from the Latin word propagare, which is to present, to increase, and so propagation. Here's where the word comes from. Okay, now who started all of this? Martin Luther, 15th, 16th century. Um, I, if you don't have an opinion of Martin Luther, you should. I'm not, I'm not going to get into that. Martin Luther certainly created a big amount of trouble in Europe, but then so did the Catholic Church. Um, when in 1517, when there was no such thing as internet or newspapers or anything, he tacked his 95 Theses on the wall of the church in Wittenberg. Amazing, isn't it? In the early 16th century, it was possible to put a message on the door of a church and to create a continental conflict. Wow, amazing. Now, part of this was made possible because of the invention of the printing press. In Mainz, the town of Mainz, Germany, a town on the Rhine River, it's a beautiful town. Someday you should visit. And there's actually a museum of the 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 first printing presses, which were developed in Mainz. Um, of course, printing presses by then were labor intensive. You had to manually put in letters and words, and you had to make an engraving was a very complicated thing. Today we do it with AI, but this was an amazing step forward in human technology. The printing press, mainly what the printing press was used for initially was to print the Bible. And for the first time in human history, normal people could have a written text in their home. This was an enormous step forward. And again, this is values neutral. I don't think that the printing press itself had a propagandistic goal, but it was the tool used by all sides in conducting hybrid warfare. Um, Now, some of the early propaganda in the Catholic Church, and I will later show in the Soviet Union also, was beautiful. At the very beginning, look, El Greco, the painter who was utilized by the Catholic Church to try to draw back into the church the European citizens who had abandoned it. And they did this through printing the Bible on both sides, Catholic and Protestant, but also the use of art. And, El Greco, Domenicos Theotokopoulos, a Greek painter nicknamed El Greco, but very much part of the strategic communications plan of the Catholic Church. Made these beautiful images. This is beautiful, beautiful. There's nothing nasty about this. There's nothing that inspires hatred um, or distrust. These are amazing photographs. So before we condemn propaganda entirely, we should recognize that there's great beauty in propaganda, um, and this is very effective in creating emotions in the viewer that would draw them into a cause. Again, this is part of the strategic communications um, project of the Catholic Church. Now, what happened? The Catholic Church, the Protestants began to slaughter each one another. In the 16th century in France, there was not 1 year in an entire century without internal warfare. If you plan to go back in time and be reborn at an earlier time, do not choose France of the 16th century. Do not choose Europe during 1618 to 1648. These were horrible conflicts. This is not soft power. Okay, now we need to define propaganda before we can contrast it with public diplomacy. Um, and I have found various definitions that overlap a lot. The first thing to say about propaganda is when it works well, you don't think it's propaganda. It's deceit. Remember Sun Tzu? Um, the element of deceit in strategy, going back to our sessions in the fall. Fool them. Convince them that this is not propaganda, then they will believe it. And we know that that's what RT and the other Russian blogs and forms of communication, we know that that's what they seek to do. And in many instances, they succeed in convincing the viewer this is not propaganda, this is truth. Not easy. John Brown, a friend and hero of mine, has developed a lot, his own thoughts, and I'll share some of them. The best propaganda does not, best, he means the most effective, the most efficient propaganda seems not to be propaganda. You can define propaganda by telling us what it's not. Amazing. Now, early Soviet Union, again, this is beautiful. Um, um, we were not born for money. Well, money was not the reason we were born. Um, um, yeah, Vladimir Mayakovsky, who was a fantastic artist who believed fervently very early in the Soviet experiment in 1920s, early 30s, when people still believed that communism might be a good system. I don't condemn them for having this abstract idea. Communism, let's share, let's everybody work together and um, from each according to their abilities, to each according to their need. Beautiful idea. It just never worked. At the beginning phases of the Soviet Union, the artists, and they were propagandists, um, produced beautiful images. This is beautiful. This is inspirational. Look, the family, they're devoted, they're marching forward with a mutual goal, a nation building goal. This was not hostile. This was not based on hatred or fear. 1920, when, of course, this was the period of the Civil War between the Bolsheviks and the White Russians. This was a poster used in the middle of the Civil War, which I think went from 20, 1919 to 21, something like that. Um, Pretty bad conflict, but the propagandists very properly showed a beautiful image of a family, working the earth. These are farmers, simple people. They're not elites. They're banding together for a good cause. Nothing offensive, nothing bad about that. Now, Vladimir Mayakovsky, who was a genius, a poet, he designed this poster, which is very beautiful. Mayakovsky. Stalin said of him, the best and most talented poet of our Soviet epoch. Well, then why did Mayakovsky commit suicide in 1930? I leave that an open question. Mayakovsky himself was an inspired propagandist. He was not a bad person. He believed that communism might be a better way of human beings organizing. We know that the purges, 1936-37, were devastating, and many individuals very committed to the Soviet mission, to the Communist Party, were either killed, murdered, assassinated, executed, or took their own lives. Now, going further into the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union put a satellite into space, Sputnik, 1957. This is beautiful, is it not? This is nothing, there's nothing hateful about this. It is propaganda. It is part of a strategic communications plan by the Soviet Union to employ their finest artists in projecting a positive image. Um, Dmitry Kuleba, with more recent information, tells us, and I think convincingly, it's easier to get a reaction for somebody with a negative image than with a positive image. They didn't know that in the early stages of propaganda, and they used positive images. This is not offensive. This is not ugly. Now, propaganda is used for various purposes. The United States certainly used propaganda. Later, we'll see Nicholas Cull, who now teaches public diplomacy at the University of Southern California, says the the reason we have public diplomacy in the United States is because of Joseph Stalin. Thank you, Stalin. You provoked us. You required us to have a response. Now, this is World War II, famous poster. And, we've all seen many different tropes based on this original image. Again, in itself, there's nothing hateful about this. The purpose of this type of propaganda is exhortation, encouraging somebody to do something for a cause greater than themselves. Famous poster. Now, propaganda can also have notes of caution to citizens. Nie baltai, don't gossip. Um, don't be spreading. Be careful what you say, because the idea that the sort of paranoid idea there are spies among it. Don't say things carelessly because the enemy might find out. This begins to be a little bit negative. We're going in a progression from positive to negative. Americans had the identical notion the walls have ears, the communists are listening. So this is basically no difference at all between Soviet propaganda and American propaganda, uh, encouraging people to be cautious. There's nothing evil about this. There's a little bit of paranoia, but be careful of what you say. Now, another purpose of propaganda can be to develop a sense of national identity. Three, zapisajcie, yeah. Are you the just like Uncle Sam? This poster is kind of the Soviet equivalent of this American poster. Um, I need you to be part of a larger entity. Again, this isn't evil. It's not paranoid. It's an attempt to encourage people to do things for the collective well-being. Now, we begin to become negative when we use propaganda for ridicule and for identifying the other as something bad. Here we have Stalin sweeping the capitalists and their corruption, cleaning up um, Ochichayat, Lenin rather, is cleaning up the world and getting rid of the caricatures of the capitalists, the tall hat, the large belly, um, surrounded in wealth and coins, and creating a distinction between us and them. This is the beginning of a negative process. It's funny. I mean, this poster, I find it funny. Um, I don't know if it's evil, but it's the beginning of something negative. Now, we get to satire, which becomes one step further towards the negative use of propaganda. Name the enemy and ridicule them. Here is the capitalist swimming in gold coins. This is a caricature. And, we need to ask ourselves, where is this going? Are you going to kill this guy? Are you the establishment of a caricature, an exaggerated image, um, begins to be not quite as friendly as the initial. Remember these? Um, See the difference between this, where people are drawn together and they believe they're doing something positive, versus having a caricature of the enemy. This is not the same thing. This begins to be hostile. Um, and then um, this is Družba po-amerikansky. Uh, this is a pretty funny one. I must admit, I kind of am amused by this. The so-called special relationship between the US and Great Britain, here seen by Soviets as the US is bullying Great Britain and coercing them. It's funny. It creates a sense of those people, the Americans and the British. These are not our friends. And by the way, the U.S. and the UK are not equals. The U.S. is dragging and coercing the UK. Now, propaganda can also be legitimately used to animate a cause. This is World War One. Women help American sons win the war. Any country at war needs to find money to sustain the war. And here in the United States, they created something called Liberty loans. These are like treasury bills. Citizens would bring money and get a piece of paper that could later be redeemed. And the idea was the people are lending money to the government so it can finance a war. Um, Now, the war was a pretty disgusting thing. The simple act of encouraging citizens to support their own government, again, nothing terrible about that, nothing evil. Uh, I like this one. Even a dog enlist, why not you? We know that dogs were used by medical teams on the battlefields and were able to, with their olfactory mastery, they could find a survivor under rubble. We know that in Ukraine, this is very important. We have buildings that collapse. We don't know if there are people in the rubble, if they have survived, and we use dogs to um, to help us. Dogs are our friends. This is a funny poster. Now, not so funny. This is American anti-German propaganda. This is objectionable. Um, the caricature of Germany as a nation, as a mad brute, raping a white woman. This is of the Aristotle ethos, logos, pathos. This is pure pathos. Create an emotion. And I wasn't there at the time. I don't know. Did this really affect? We had no such thing as surveys that could quantify how did people react to it, a horrible image like this. The German military was doing disgusting things. The German nation, that's something different. And the idea of rape of our innocent woman by their mad brute. This is pretty nasty. So it can be. Now, and then, of course, Nazi propaganda um, created by Joseph Goebbels in the so-called Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. They didn't mind using the word propaganda. Um, when Goebbels used propaganda, now we get to really nasty stuff. Um, Here's what you should be afraid of. Create fear. Dmitry Kuleba, absolutely correct. This type of poster has a more immediate effect. We know that now. We did not know back in the 40s, but we know now that people are much more inclined to take action based on negative emotions. Normalize murder. Make it normal. Don't call it murder. Just vilify, show the caricature of the Jew who is causing all the problems behind, in secret, behind the veil of both the American and the Soviet um, entities. This is Germany, showing that all the problems in the world, both in both systems, capitalism and communism, all the problems are caused by the deceitful Jew. This is nasty, really nasty stuff. Now, I mentioned John Brown earlier. Here he's saying basically what we saw at the beginning, the intent. Let's begin to how we now see what propaganda. So what's public diplomacy? Public diplomacy really didn't really exist as a concept until um, World War II. And at that time, there was not yet the distinction between propaganda, which had good and bad things, and public diplomacy, which is meant to be purely open, transparent, positive. Um, and again, as I said earlier, this is difficult because public diplomacy also uses images and ethos, logos, pathos in order to persuade. We're talking about persuasion. Now, John Brown, a great hero, the intent of practitioners of public diplomacy and propaganda may be the same. Does that surprise you? That the intent is to persuade foreign people of something that you believe and that you think they don't believe. You want them to agree with you. The beneficiaries of these two activities are meant to be those carrying them out. Neither public diplomacy nor propaganda is altruistic. Let's pause on that. We think of public diplomacy as positive, not harmful. In fact, I maintain that that is the case. However, what is public diplomacy? It's a government spending money to persuade foreign people. Altruistic would be, we're not doing this to help the United States. We're not doing this to help a nation. We just want humanity, the well-being of humanity. We call that altruism. Public diplomacy is not altruistic because it is a government attempting to persuade foreigners of something. So the distinction becomes more and more difficult when, according to John Brown, diplomacy and propaganda have the same goal. But then he continues, um, here's what public diplomacy does. It's not easy to define it, but John Brown mentions these aspects, which are harmless and I think good, provides a truthful, factual exposition of a nation's policy, encourages international understanding, engages in dialogue, objectively displays national achievements, including the arts. This is what public diplomacy does. It's not easy to define it, but it's kind of easy to describe how it works. And then Brown continues, this is what public diplomacy does, and that's a good thing. Here's what propaganda does, and that's a bad thing. Again, the process is so overlapping that it's not easy to distinguish the one from the other. Propaganda forces its messages by repetition and slogans. Does that sound familiar? Repetition and slogans. Propaganda will try to deceive the audience, will will manipulate the audience, will not allow the viewer to draw their own conclusions. It will force it upon them. It demonizes elements of the outside world and claims the nation it glorifies can do no wrong. No comment. I think everybody in this call just had some thoughts based on this item. Demonizes the outside world. Of course, this is what Vladimir Putin does, but he's not alone. There are other world leaders doing the same thing. Simplifies complex issues, including history. Putin's so-called root causes of the current war is a simplification. It's one taking little bits of history that were mixed in with many different elements and then picking out certain ones to make a point. Misrepresents the truth or deliberately lies. Um, with some skepticism, I think we can say that all governments fall into this pattern at times. Good governments do it as little as possible. Bad governments do it all the time. Misrepresents the truth, deliberately lies. We can go through this. I don't want to take all your time. This is basically John Brown making a finer distinction. Both public diplomacy and propaganda, at their best or their worst, can achieve credibility. This is done through strategic STRATCOM, strategic communications strategy. Um, and John Brown, again, he's quite a hero to me. He admits his whole life is based on public diplomacy, and his whole life is based on condemning propaganda. But in all honesty, he's very candid. He says evaluating is very difficult. I realize that my best worst distinction is incapable of fully measuring the impact of either. So the more we get into this, the more difficult it becomes. Propaganda, public diplomacy. Oh my gosh, how can you distinguish the one from the other? I think we can race through. I've added some historical notes. This is in its embryonic state uh, during World War I. There was a thing called the Creel Commission. George Creel, who worked for Woodrow Wilson, created something called the Committee on Public Information, and this was an effort by Woodrow Wilson to convince the American people to go to war. He ran when he was a candidate for president, he promised America he would not go to war. When American ships were attacked in the North Atlantic by German vessels, and after a certain series of provocations, Woodrow Wilson decided and convinced the Congress that the U.S. would need to enter late this conflict in Europe. He completely reversed what he had promised the American people. No judgment. Maybe this was good, maybe this was bad. But at a very primitive level, he created this thing, the CPI, which later became the U.S. Information Agency, the OSS. We'll get into that. And the 4 Minute Men, humorous note, in the early days of cinema, they would have these spools of celluloid film, and you would load the film onto a projector in a movie house, and the film would go. After 20 minutes, the film would use itself up, and the operator would have to remove the celluloid film reel and insert another one in order to keep the flow of the movie. During the 4 minutes that it took to make that change, these many thousands of people, the 4 Minute Men, would jump to the front of the movie theater and harangue the audience and convince them the Germans are bad, we need to go to war. And this President Wilson, in a very primitive phase, used thousands of employees. Here I have, look at them. There were thousands of them. They would go into movie theaters and and harangue the audience during those 4 minutes that it took to change the rhythm. It's a funny little side note. Now, these things evolved. We don't need to dwell on the what they called them. Uh, President Roosevelt created during at the very onset of the American participation in World War II, the coordinator of information, utilizing this famous character. Beautiful stories. There are biographies of this crazy guy, Wild Bill Donovan. He was dynamic and he was energetic and he was a propagandist. Um, at the same time, Roosevelt also created the Office of Strategic Services, which went through various iterations and which was later renamed the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. So the OSS, which had 13,000 employees in 1942, was the origin of the CIA. Now, here's Wild Bill Donovan, quite a character. Um, for relief and amusement, track down a biography of this guy. He was crazy. He was passionate. People loved him. People hated him. Anyway, many, many, many employees. No internet. No, not much use of printing. These were individuals um, talking directly with people. Um, After World War II, information as a tool of war gradually converted. In World War I, we didn't, it's propaganda. What the US government, the Wilson administration, that was propaganda. Later, we get to something called public diplomacy, and that's the end of that series. And I think I have time to take you, let's quickly go through part two. We move here from propaganda to public diplomacy. John Brown, here he is. Um, PhD, Russian history, 1977. He was the cultural attaché in Moscow at a time when it seemed that the Russian Federation was going to be mm, maybe changing for the better. Um, uh, John is a neighbor of mine. He's not in good health right now, but he's exemplary. He is my source on making these distinctions. It doesn't really matter, but John Brown, of the 7,000 diplomats employed at the State Department, when President Bush made the idiotic decision to invade Iraq, John Brown sent a letter to Secretary of State Colin Powell, very respectfully, saying, "I I joined the U.S. Information Agency, later um, put into the State Department. That's a small detail." He says, "In good conscience, I cannot support this war." Of 7,000 diplomats, he was the only one who resigned on principle. There were four who resigned, but only John resigned on principle. To me, this makes him a hero. He didn't make a big public thing of this. We do have a text of the letter he wrote to Colin Powell. He had great respect for Powell, but he said, "I joined the State Department because I love our country. Respectfully, Mr. Secretary, I am now bringing this calling to a close with a heavy heart, but for the same reason that I embraced it." Again, just to give a sense to you, who is John Brown? He is a man of principle. He came closer than anybody else to defining how is propaganda and public diplomacy different. It's not easy. Now, the Congressional Research Service, which is an excellent institution in Washington, whose purpose is to inform the Congress. It's a research team and if you look up CRS on the internet, you'll find these are now open source. They used to be kind of semi-secret. You can find their studies of what's happening in Guinea-Conakry this week. Well, the previous military leader got himself elected last week. The CRS is an outstanding source. And it's taken up this task of trying to define public diplomacy. Um, and they define public diplomacy as a government effort to conduct foreign policy um, through direct outreach and communication, strategic communication. Again, we're just setting the scene for Thursday when we'll talk about more in depth. What is Stratcom? This is Stratcom. Um, this is a long text. I just want to draw your attention to the items in bold. It's information. It was broadcast and internet media until President Trump removed almost the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. We will have as our guest in a couple of weeks Tom Kent, who was the director of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, um, which now exists in name, but has basically been dismantled by the Trump administration. The Again, we're defining public diplomacy here. It's cultural, it's educational, it's professional, and um, let me let's see. I want to no, I forget where I cite this, but through legislation, public diplomacy um, cannot be, first of all, cannot be disseminated in the United States because that would be an instance of a government haranguing its people. Um, but very importantly, in the Fulbright-Hays Act, which legalized and gave a budget to this process, it talked about mutual understanding, mutual understanding. I want to be a bit didactic here because very few American diplomats take that seriously, but it's in the law. It is as important for us to understand them as it is for them to understand us. It's called mutual understanding. And you can see that my level of frustration over the years, I've met very few American diplomats who take that seriously. It's the law, or it was. Now, here's some history of the use of the term. Walter Lippmann was um, a famous analyst. He was a journalist. He was at times he collaborated with President Wilson in conveying messages. Lippmann um, was kind of a prophet back in the 40s and 50s. He was sort of the founding father, so to speak, of what later became public diplomacy. Edmund Gullion, who was military, he was SACEUR again as the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, ambassador to later became dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University outside of Boston. And Edmund Gullion was the first to actually use the term in 1965. So the term public diplomacy is its origin is in 1965. That's pretty late, huh? That's after World War I, after World War II. Gullion, a military guy, not a civilian, but who became an academic, said, we don't like this word propaganda. Let's call it public diplomacy. So that's the origin of the term as we use it these days. Again, history, I can race through this. The Declaration of Independence is a remarkable example of public diplomacy. You all recognize what it looks like. The purpose that Americans, I think, are familiar with this. Others may not be. The purpose of the Declaration of Independence, yeah, it was partly to say we're no longer obeying the King of England. Okay. But the real purpose was to convince Europe that what the United States was doing was legitimate. And here's where we get into God-given rights. We don't recognize the king. We do recognize the social contract as the idea created by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And we're drawing from European philosophers and European traditions. Why? So as to convince the people of Europe that we are legitimate. This is public affairs or propaganda, as you wish. It's one of the finest examples of propaganda or public diplomacy in the history of the United States. And when it was published in 1776, the United States did not even exist. So this is an amazing document whose purpose was to convince the world, to them, the world was Europe. Um, we are legitimate. It's an amazing document. Okay, Public Opinion 1922, I mentioned Lippmann. Something to look at if you're quite interested in this field, that's something you'll want to look at. I don't want to dwell on. There's Walter Lippmann. John Dewey, here he is, an educator who believed that communication is best done not through observation, but through participation. I have many anecdotes from working in embassies overseas. I know that blah, 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 conferences, talk about democracy, nonsense, ridiculous. Let's do something together. Let's do it together. It will create a relationship. Um, I've encountered very few people in diplomacy of any country who understand this. You will create understanding by engaging people in projects and endeavors where they work together. They may be different. They may be um, disagree on many things, but if you involve them and have them work together on something, this will create a relationship. Public diplomacy is all about relationships. I mentioned earlier Nicholas Cole. Here's where he kind of humor in a humorous way. The real founder of American post-war public diplomacy was Joseph Stalin. In other words, and he's being funny here. Um, Cole is a British national, but who's become an American citizen. He's he is the 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 most accomplished historian of public diplomacy. He's very much alive and active in California and often joins audiences in Washington to go through the history, the meaning, the definition. He's quite something. Now, again, let's rush through this. The National Security Act after World War II, what do we do with public diplomacy? They were rethinking this. President Eisenhower was amazingly perceptive at at what needed to happen. This made official the creation. The OSS became the CIA in 1948 by legislation. The National Security Council, which did not exist really before World War II, was created in the NSA of 1948. The Office of Special Projects. Overt operations, not the CIA, which is covert, overt operations. Smith-Mundt prohibited domestic distribution. Why? Because we had just fought a war against Nazi Germany, which had a Joseph Goebbels ministry of propaganda. And the United States wanted to be sure we're not going to do that. But there's a little bit of hypocrisy here because any government will try to convince its people legitimately of its mission and actions. But in any case, it was illegal to distribute domestically. People ask why. Well, so that we did not have any resemblance to the Nazi party. Eisenhower, who we think of as a military guy, was very perceptive when he talked about the P factor. And it was Eisenhower, a military guy. We had Edward Gullion, Eisenhower. These are military guys. They were smart. Eisenhower created in 1953 the U.S. Information Agency. Interesting. It was his idea. Later, under President Kennedy, our hero, the best director we ever had, USIA. I'm so sorry I never met him. Edward R. Murrow, who took a 90% salary cut. He was probably the most prominent journalist TV journalist in America. His colleague, John Kennedy, wrote to him in New York and said, "Would you please come to Washington and become the USIA director? You will have to take a cut in salary of 90%, 90%." And Murrow responded to Kennedy. He said, "Okay, I'll do it." And Murrow was a tough guy. When Kennedy um, made this enormous mistake, the Bay of Pigs, when he allowed his own CIA to convince him, "Oh, we can invade Cuba, we can get rid of Castro," and then the disastrous outcome. The Cuban Americans who were sent on this mission, they were all killed. And then Kennedy went to Murrow and he said, "How do I explain this to the public?" And Murrow said, at the bottom here, "If you want me there on the crash landings, you'll have to have me at the takeoffs." And this was the first salvo of public diplomacy saying to a government, "We need to be present when you're making your policy. Don't come to us afterwards, after you do your stupid things, and ask us to make them look good. We cannot do that, and we will not do that." Murrow was the greatest leader we ever had. Um, let's race through these things too. I highlight mutual understanding. Fulbright Hayes. Under Kennedy, this whole thing was made into a law, the mutual education, sometimes called the Fulbright-Hayes Act. And in that law, mutual understanding. I made that point earlier. Jimmy Carter very foolishly renamed it USICA. Looks like CIA, doesn't it? That was a silly, stupid mistake. And we had to walk that back. Carter, wonderful president, but he made this kind of silly. Why rename it? It's the U.S. Information Agency. Anyway, uh, when I joined USIA, it was President Reagan, and the director of USIA was this questionable person, Charles Wick. The only thing he ever did was made a stupid film called Bedtime for Bonzo. But he was a close friend of Ronald Reagan, and Reagan said, "Take the USIA, it's all yours." And Wick stayed there for 8 years. He created WorldNet. He did some silly, in retrospect, pretty silly. WorldNet was a communications device before internet. This was before internet. Um, WorldNet was the use of satellites to have conversations in real time, synchronous conversations between experts in the US and audiences, usually journalists in Europe and in other parts of the world. In those days, it cost a ton of money, $20,000 per hour, whereas today it would be zero, free. But he spent a lot of money building up this WorldNet. We're getting to time here. I just want to mention, um, you heard Murrow say to Kennedy, "If you want me there on the crash landings, I have to be there on the takeoffs." In the 1980s, the Soviet Union put in SS-22 missiles. These were intermediate range nuclear weapons that could reach Europe. And the Europeans in the UK and Germany, other countries, were well aware of the threat that the Soviet Union could kill them, could uh, turn their cities, London, Paris, Berlin, into something like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The United States responded by installing Patriot missiles in Germany, England, mainly in those two countries. The people of those two countries rose up in rebellion. You had 1 million people in the streets in London, 1 million in Berlin. The government's going, "What's going on here? Wait a minute, wait a minute. There's a public opinion. Whoa, whoa, whoa." And this, I personally, I've never seen this written down anywhere. I would say this was the beginning of a consciousness on the part of Western governments that public opinion was not something nice. It's not paintings and nice dinners. It's crucial in a democratic society, to understand public opinion, because if you don't, Margaret Thatcher was almost removed from power. Ronald Reagan, when they put in these Patriot missiles to respond to the Soviet installations, the publics would not have it. That was the beginning of a process where in democratic nations, the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, um, the public opinion became part of the policy only because they were astonished at the opposition, which could have removed a government through a democratic process. Um, the rest, I'm going to speed through this, and let's say we're in conclusion here. Clinton very foolishly talked about the peace dividend after the end of the Soviet Union. He said, "Oh, okay, check. We did that. We got rid of the Soviet Union. Now we no longer need to put money into public diplomacy." Terrible mistake, stupid mistake, um, and um, and his objectionable leader, the administrator, Joe Duffy, who was an idiot. He was the head of USIA and was convinced um, by Clinton to get to dismantle his own agency, which he did. 1999, the U.S. Information Agency was abolished, and the survivors, like me, were then transferred from USIA into the State Department. This uh, succeeded, oh, and also diminished the resources available to public diplomacy. Madeleine Albright was perfectly in agreement. Let's get rid of USIA. Terrible mistake. Um, and here is the bewildering insignificance. Caravan prohodit sabakalayat. One after the next, one after the next. These are people nobody remembers. Under Obama, four different heads of public diplomacy in the State Department. Under Trump, these four, nobody remembers these people. Suddenly, and I think it's Bill Clinton, we can, and Margaret, um, 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 and his Secretary of State, we can blame them for really not understanding. Public diplomacy is always necessary. You don't just employ it at times of conflict and then dismantle it later. You don't do that. That's stupid. So getting to the end, and we're going to have Rick Ruth, here he is right there, talk to us in a couple of weeks. Rick Ruth kept public diplomacy alive all by himself. Uh, he's not known to the public. He's very much known among his colleagues. He's a patriarch. He's an inspired guy who, through all these stupid political things, I mean, all these idiots, not, well, one of them is not an idiot. That's Bruce Wharton. Wonderful, wonderful friend of public diplomacy, a great guy. But the other seven, they were ciphers. They were nothing. Rick Ruth, working in the back office, he was never in front. He never had a fancy title. He was always in the back, advising, um, taking proposals to the House of Representatives to get the funding. And he will talk to us in a couple of weeks about why is public diplomacy so crucial and how do you do it? How do you do it? Most people who do it have no understanding of what they're doing because they don't have strategic communications, which we're going to have this month and next. Just a couple of these quotes. They're all beautiful. It's not about the technology. It's about the person who delivers and the person who receives. Public diplomacy, when it works, is a question of relationships, friendships, things that go on for more than a nanosecond. You can publish a blog or a tweet, it'll be quickly forgotten. But when you have a friend, that's public diplomacy. Um, um, and his third quote, the best single antidote to a poisoned environment is human authenticity. Be honest, be open. Rick Ruth will talk to us about the United States has done some really stupid things, some really evil things. We don't avoid that. We don't lie about it. We just say, yes, we had we have a racist past. Um, we have a terrible pattern of foreign warfare. This thing in Venezuela, I guarantee, is going to have a bad consequence. Don't be open, just be human. Remember that public diplomacy is about human beings in touch with one another. We may have common views. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be in favor of a current president or a current administration. But we are people, you are people. Let's get together and have mutual understanding. There's Rick. He's going to talk to us in a couple of weeks. And the best photo I've ever seen illustrating this principle is my friend Steve Thibault, who was stuck in Baghdad in 1990. He was a human shield. You may remember when Saddam Hussein said, "If you attack me, your diplomats, I will kill them." And he singled out the United States, Japan, UK, and another one, which had diplomats stuck in Baghdad during the buildup to the Bush senior invasion. And Saddam Hussein said, the first people to be killed will be your diplomats. Here's Steve Thibault, my friend, at this is an amazing photo. Look at him. He's joking. These are people calling for him to be killed. These are people that have been rallied by Saddam Hussein, whose picture is there, and they're saying, death to America, death to America. What's remarkable here, look at this guy on the right. He's smiling because Steve was something of a clown. He was joking with these people. He created a relationship. And you can see that the ones who are physically close enough to Steve to understand what he's saying, they're laughing, they're smiling. It's an amazing, amazing photograph. And I there is an interview online which I did with him. I can provide that. But here he is when when we had dinner on February 12th, 2024. And that's Steve. This benign friendship, this smile, this is true public diplomacy. I don't know if it's going to survive. Um, and we'll leave that as an open question. And we'll say goodbye. We've gone an hour and a half. I don't want to abuse your time. Let's see. There are some. Oh, Matthias. Yes, thanks. Oh, Matthias Chentra. Matthias, I invite you on Thursday to develop the idea you've put in the chat. Matthias Chentra is a marvelous example. He's a colleague um, from Cameroon. He in Yaoundé. We worked together um, whenever that was, Matthias, and 2005, 2006. Um, Matthias, the local employee of the US Embassy, a Cameroonian, was able to tell me what needed to be done because he understood his country. I did not. And with Matthias, we were able to do some remarkable things. Matthias, on Thursday, if you'd like to give a few minutes, we would appreciate that. So concluding for today, let me just say, what is the Oka? What is it in your? No, Matthias has a funny poster behind him. We're going to say goodbye for today. What's coming up on Thursday? I want to show you some of these websites and blogs. I want to begin to describe what is it I want you to do in this course. We'll look at some examples of strategic communications. Again, there's no morality in this really. What there is that we assume that if we are communicating something, we believe in ourselves. We believe that what we're communicating can be of value to the other side. I don't want to call them audiences because we want to engage them. We don't want them to be passive. We want to have them working with us towards a common goal. And again, the two purposes of this workshop. Number one, construct a strategic communications plan. That sounds very difficult. We're going to make it easy on Thursday. And secondly, can we involve ourselves with some of the NGOs in Europe, and there may be some in Asia, maybe in Africa? Can we involve ourselves and become part of that process. Boniface, your comment? Um, can
Yeah,
you, yeah, go ahead.
thank you, Dr. Whitman. Very excited for this part of the program.
Thank you.
Uh, but I'd like to hear your thoughts as we wind up on the Venezuela situation. You mentioned at the beginning, and
I,
it's very fascinating that this is happening right now.
yeah, thank you, Boniface. I was afraid someone would ask. And um, I'm ashamed, I'm embarrassed. I have nothing good to say about this. The first thought I had when I learned this news was Vladimir Putin will be delighted if the President of the United States believes it's legitimate to invade a neighboring country. Well, then, I guess that justifies Putin's invasion of Ukraine. That was the first thought I had. I know. The consequences of this action will be long and they will be tragic. Um, we have no idea what will happen in Venezuela. It won't be good. The vice president, Maduro's in New York under indictment. Who's there? Who's been left behind? We have an elected president recognized by the Maduro regime. There's been no mention of that individual by the White House. That person should be president, right? He was elected. What about the vice president of Maduro, who might be possibly able to run a country? We know that when large countries invade small countries, it creates agony, disorder, and always a bad result. Um, Boniface, your own impression? Okay.
Well, yeah, I think for me, still reading the situation, but I, I think the sentiment I'm getting from people in Kenya on this is it's creating also a lot of anxiety for sovereign leaders on this side of the world. That the U.S. has demonstrated that it will um, use whatever means necessary. You know, despite the structures that exist within the principles of
Mm,
international law, and we have a lot of a lot of our African heads of state are anxious silently that this is a fate that could befall them anytime soon. So
um,
a lot of anxiety there. But of
I
course,
don't,
it's. I think the question is how justice can be seen to be done in
yeah.
in whatever the outcome.
Boniface, you've stated that very eloquently. I really thank you for that. Plus, as we know, 30 American ambassadors, more in Africa than in any other continent, last week were fired. What's that all about? No, it's just more than perplexing. Um, it's in terms of what we learned during our fall sessions, strategy, smart, strategic, measurable, and so forth. What in the world? How does this fit into smart? What and then income, input, output, outcome, result. What's the goal here? Is the goal to bring democracy to the Venezuelan people? Apparently not, because there is an elected president who's not part of this. So the goal, there has been no stated goal. We know it's because Venezuela has the largest deposits of unexploited petroleum in the world. I mean, there's no secret. The president has said that. We're going to take the oil. Um, in terms of strategy, in terms of our course, you can have moral and you can have anxiety, which I have. Um, the question is, in terms of strategy, what is this? What's the goal? Is it simply to take petroleum? Um, that's from a foreign country, just take it? Is it to stabilize a nation? Maduro was a terrible, violent, corrupt individual, ruining his country. We know that. What are the consequences of just simply removing him without a stated goal? Gleb, let me stop recording and let's continue to discuss. I'm just going to Let's see. Da, da, da. Stop recording.